Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Artificial DM. So today, we're going to be taking a look at another RPG horror story. And this horror story in particular is one that deals with certain adult themes and topics. Now, I have expressed before that if all players and the DM are willing to have adult content in their games, then by all means, go ahead. But what this player does goes way above the boundary line. What this player does should not be tolerated in any game. Let's go ahead and hear Dr. Dungeon's tale in this RPG horror story. Creepy player controls best friend, writes sexual fantasies into backstory, sends ungodly amount of smut fanfic to DM, and derails whole campaign using the terrible powers of the animes. This is the two-part tale of how a player not only killed 2 of my campaigns, but also my whole group. Warning: super long and very not suitable for work. Backstory: I started and led a D&D group in order to teach some of my interested friends how to play. Most of the cast isn't important for this, so here's the Cliff Notes version. Warlock, aforementioned creepy destroyer of worlds and groups, extroverted, but strangely had very few friends due to something being off about her. Every conversation involving her inevitably turned sexual, and she had a tendency to say things that made people uncomfortable. I put this down as her just being a little out there, and invited her to join, hoping a little escapism would help her social skills. Cleric, Warlock's best friend, and I mean best friend. I'm talking Han and Chewie best friend, Harry and Ron, Jake and Charles best friend. Although it was very obvious who was the Jake and who was the Charles in this partnership. Cleric was very quiet and shy, talked very little when in public, and seemed the most uncomfortable whenever Warlock derailed the conversation into her crazy sexual tirades. I have no idea how they managed to stay best friends, but they did. Warlock asked if she could join as well, and I accepted because hey, the more players, the better. Everyone else, awesome group, bar one chaotic stupid, not really interested in the game, who dropped out 2 sessions in. I still play D&D with them occasionally, one-shots and party games and the like. They don't really feature in this story. So, the first game begins, and immediately, the first red flags in what would become a sea of red flags over a previously perfectly fine runway occurred, when Cleric, whom I'll remind you was extremely quiet and introverted, showed up to the first session with 2 solid pages of backstory for her half-elven cleric. I was impressed, and more than a little surprised, but became immediately suspicious. The way she interacted with her backstory and role-playing was more akin to cosplay than actual roleplay, like she wasn't totally invested in the character. After some inquiries, I discovered my fears were confirmed. She hadn't actually written any of the backstory herself. Warlock had done it all for her, and basically handed her a backstory to use, with little to no input from her. I also later found out that she had emphasis on heavily, encouraged her to play cleric, even at one point using her religion, cleric is Christian, as a way to convince her. A quick note on another, much creepier red flag: both backstories, for Warlock's own character and the one she wrote for cleric, contained a male love interest, and believe me when I say they were the same exact dude. A heroic, brave, pretty boy with a heart of gold who finds the heroine during dark times in their life and saves them with unconditional love and adoration. In itself, weird. But both backstories also included a horrible thing happening to the love interest. Dead in one due to the cleric failing to save him, in another saw Warlock do a bad thing and ran away horrified, and the heroine out to find him, or resurrect him in Cleric's case, and prove that she still loves him. Now, I won't say that all that fanfiction she sent me was smut, because that would be untrue. What I will say is that so much of it was smut that what wasn't quickly faded into the background as the two main characters got their junk out again. There were pages upon pages of her describing in very explicit detail how good the love interest was at sex, and how many times they gave each other sex in various different scenarios. At one point, she started writing alternate universe fics for her own character, I remind you, and following that, I honestly lost count how many times I saw her share a fic with the title involving the words, "First Time." It's already bad enough that Warlock went out of her way to write backstory for another player, but then to go ahead and write pages upon pages of smut for her character, her friend's character, and then making additional fanfic to go into detail about how much love and sex you're having with this magical male character. Oh, it's very creepy. Now, if she wanted to go ahead and write this fanfiction for her own self, write it, put it up online, go ahead. Don't force that into your backstory for your DM and other players to read, please. Anyway, let's go ahead and find out how the rest of this show went. Luckily, Cleric didn't give in to the pressure from Warlock, but unluckily, that meant Warlock decided to take over. Turns out, she snuck one major detail about the backstory past Cleric. The night her love interest died was the same night Cleric and him did it for the first time, and what followed was, honest to God, 11 pages of blow-by-blow, no pun intended, account of her first night with eye-watering levels of detail that would make even the most perverted porn writer ask to tone it down. I deleted all of these without reading them, but couldn't bring myself to tell her to stop. It was an awkward conversation to have at the best of times, but between this and her constant sexualization of everything that crossed her path, I was beginning to suspect that her weirdness might be stemming from her being more pent up than Stephanie Meyer's after 3 months at an all-girls Catholic bush camp. I don't know who Stephanie Meyer's is. Oh! Okay, that's a good joke. Oh, okay. For those of you at home who don't know, she's the one that wrote the Twilight series. I decided to leave it and hope that once she got it out of her system, she would be alright. On a less creepy but still weird note, both stories involved their characters being ostracized for the racial differences. Warlock herself asked me what race was most discriminated against in my world, and picked a tiefling based on that exact premise. And she referenced in Cleric's backstory that her character was ostracized for being part elf in a human community, despite me saying on several occasions that elves and humans got along quite well in my world, ever since they teamed up to stop Orcus destroying the world at one point. Whenever I brought this up, she would nod like she understood, but then go right back to telling Cleric to play up the discrimination more in her role-playing, as if I hadn't even spoken. But that was how it went with Warlock. If I ever told her something that contradicted how she thought it should go, she would basically pretend it didn't exist. That was just how it worked in her little world. So, the game begins, and immediately more red flags. Warlock slept with literally everything, and I mean everything. If there was a thing between them and their goal, and that thing had a conscience, a body, and at least one working limb, she was rolling those seduction rolls and trying to convince me that a 12 is enough to seduce a literal bone devil. This was also when she would embark on one of her very frequent tangents about how sexually appealing her character is. She had made a tiefling warlock and decided, no input from me, that a 16 in charisma meant she was basically the sexiest thing alive. So, not an action passed without her mentioning how low cut her skirt was, or how only one button was done on her bodice, so her breast practically flew out every time she cast a spell. These tangents creeped everyone at the table out, especially me, since she would insist on role-playing every flirtation session that went on for 10 times as long as they needed to be. One of the other players did their best to salvage the situation by roleplaying his paladin as growing up in such a strict household that he didn't even know what sex was, but it was clear he was struggling. All his desperate inputs in the hope that she would realize the effect she was having on the rest of us felt like a dying man clutching at a life raft. A life raft she swiftly popped with a dart gun shaped like a willy and left him floundering for air. And yes, I would like to retry that analogy, please. Speaking of the effect she was having, she seemed to think she was the life of the party, and that her constant sexual nature was somehow appealing to us. Every single time she did something inappropriate, she would none so subtly turn to a male member at the table and do this really weird wink that looks like a bad sitcom actor having a stroke halfway through a major punchline. It created this bizarre situation where whenever she opened her mouth, half the table would suddenly desperately need the loo, or see something really interesting on the ceiling, or make a breakthrough regarding dice tower building that they must intently squint at for the next 10 minutes to preserve. This wasn't even mentioning her behavior in-game. Her character, whose backstory I later found was basically a copy-paste from some anime she watched, absolutely dominated the playing session. She would insist on long, lengthy quests to achieve her goals, and would drag the party along by the nose, while simultaneously telling them bugger all about her backstory. Yes, she was an edgelord of the worst kind, who imagined the rest of the players as endlessly curious as to what her mysterious past was, when really they couldn't give less of a shit about it, and just wanted to get on with the main plot. I played along for a while, but even when I tried to move the spotlight to someone else, she would find a way to steal it back. At one point, the paladin character was given a quest to rescue some POWs from a hobgoblin fortress. She literally waved him aside during his own damn mission briefing to negotiate with his direct superior on behalf of the rest of the party. She then had the cast iron balls to ask him why she herself should care about doing it, the irony sailing merrily over her head like the last semblance of team spirit and cooperation in our group as it hurled itself out the window to its death. But all this pales in comparison to her biggest flaw. The thing that I will never forgive her for, because it did the worst bad player sin imaginable. It killed a new player's interest in D&D. See, whenever we got together, it didn't take long for an unofficial seating arrangement to crop up around the table, but nobody enforced this harder than Warlock. At every session, she had to be sitting next to Cleric. This was so that throughout the whole session, she could continually instruct her on what to do, what to say, how to play her character, what her character would do, say, think at the time, etc. I learned to just speak over the continual whispering sounds coming from my left, as at the time I didn't really grasp what was happening. Warlock picked up the rules much quicker than Cleric, and I just assumed she was trying to help her. It wasn't until too late that I realized what was really going on. At one point after a long quest, they saved the god of time from his stasis that he placed himself in, mistakenly thinking the world was about to end. After freeing him, a lengthy process involving a rather original and well done, if I do say so myself, boss fight against an old man with only a dagger and 5 hit points, but who endlessly resurrected once killed until all the clocks in the room were smashed. The god turned back time to the moment Cleric failed to save her love interest to give her another shot. She redid the moment, this time preventing his death thanks to hindsight, and woke up in the present day to find them now happily married and having left the other adventurers behind years ago. This led to some really nice roleplay involving her character, and for the briefest of moments, I saw a glimmer of potential in the way she expertly roleplayed, the clash of emotions, and the breakdown her character went through as a result. The happiness of saving love interest clashing with the sadness of leaving her friends behind without a goodbye was actually quite touching and well played out. Ruined immediately when Warlock, who had been silent for the last 5 minutes, dropped a new backstory in front of her mid-roleplay, saying, "Here, your new character!" And just like that, the glass window shattered. Cleric retreated back into herself, quietly picking up the new backstory, and started rolling stats. Anyway, I know it's the long one, but this was my woes with Warlock as a party member. join me in the second part of this story where I detail the absolute show that occurred when she took up the DM position and how it killed not just the campaign, but the whole group stone dead. Okay, so as I said before, if you want adult themes in your campaign, go ahead, do them. But damn, the Warlock is an Edgelord, a Weeb, also kind of the Horny Bard, and a control freak. It's crazy how she's able to manipulate and control the other player, and honestly, she probably does that in their friendship as well. So far, it's already a really sad story, and truthfully, the DM should have stepped up. He should have said, alright, Cleric needs to have her own voice, or do the fade to black. Either way, DM is at fault here. Now, with that, I'm not going to go ahead and hold off for part 2. We're going to go ahead and dive into the second part of this story. Creepy player becomes DM, shows favoritism to best friend, kills group in 3 sessions. The saga of Warlock continues. So, after the last time I wrote about Warlock and her quest to turn all of D&D into her sexual fantasy playground, I mentioned there was a follow-up part where I let her DM the group. Many people wondered why I would do such a thing if she had already proven herself to be a terrible player. So, in the interest of putting enough material for my psyche evaluation on the internet for a few years' time, when the murders begin, I thought I'd share that story with you today. So our group was entering its 2nd year, and ever since session 1, Warlock had been asking me, none so subtly, how long my game was going to last, and when I would be letting someone else DM. I told her several times I had several fairly long games planned for the group, until everyone in the group understood the rules well enough that I could hand over the reins. I explained that this was not a decision to be taken lightly, as a bad DM could lose us players, but she had already stopped listening by that point. I had told her everything she wanted to know. So the games went on, and every session she dropped some hint or another, with all the discretion and care of a B2 flying fortress, about how she thought everyone understood the rules pretty well by now, and how excited she was to run her own campaign, or how much work she was putting into it. Eventually, she wore me down, and, now heartily sick of everything about her, and planning my long-delayed suicide by car exhaust if she made one more reference to illegally downloading the DMG, I let her DM a game. Things started badly. And thinking back, those 3 words might as well be the tagline for this whole sordid business. In order to judge her quality as a DM, I had her run a one-shot with the whole group. Unfortunately, due to personal reasons, I had to abscond from attending at the last minute, but I did grill the other players thoroughly for information, and one thing I noticed right off was that though they all said it was good, none of them would tell me why, and their smiles seemed oddly fixed as they did so. So I went deeper. By that, I mean I banged 2 of the players' heads together until they started making squishing noises, and then asked them nicely again. And that was when I saw the speeding train, fast approaching the railway line I was now tied to. Warlock, in this analogy, the snidely Whiplash twirling his mustache by the side of the rail, had basically focused the entire thing around a copy-paste of a character from an anime. I forget which one. It was an old dragon king who the players were trying to kill for some reason. Apparently, Warlock ranted for 5 minutes about how good and nice this dragon is, and how amazing he made everything, and then acted surprised when the party didn't want to immediately accept a contract on his life from one shadowy dude in the sewers based on nothing more than, "He'll pay you lots of money." Eventually, she hand-wavedly railroaded them with a, "Anyway, you all accept this contract and are now on your way to kill the dragon." Then they had some combat, which apparently was a nightmare because she described every enemy the exact same way. There was a masked dude there wearing robes. So, gauging threat from any individual enemy was impossible when the boss of all religion anywhere ever was apparently identical in every way to Derek the underpaid understudy who lost his girlfriend this morning and just isn't feeling it today, you guys. A weird thing was that all the enemies' reasons for wanting to kill them essentially boiled down to things the NPC tagalongs had done, not the players. So, not only are the party being railroaded, they're still playing second fiddle to a bunch of all-black edgelords, who are probably, definitely, DMPCs, based on how she kept banging on about how great they were. Then they got to the dragon itself, and this is where things start to get weird. One of the players, a halfling bard, ends up the dragon to death. I am so frustrated with this stupid story. From here, the story splits into two diverging paths based on who was telling it. And while I know which one I believe, neither side has ever relented and admitted which is true. Warlock and Cleric both insist that the player's decision was a complete shock to both of them, and ruined the final boss encounter Warlock had planned. But she let him do it anyway, because she believes in player choice, and the sanctity of the game, and what was that beginning of this session, never heard of it, etc, etc. But the other players, including the bard himself, tells a very different story. According to them, Warlock had been pressuring Bard to use seduction more during the quest, because that's what bards do. Eventually, after the third raving cultist that he didn't immediately try to stick his dick in, she implemented a new system, where he had to roll wisdom saving throws every time he met someone to repress the nymphomania that he didn't have. She also mentioned, I estimate, about 9 billion times that dragons in her world can literally have fatal heart attacks and die if they have good enough sex. And every time she said that, she would be quiet for a few seconds, as if waiting for the other players to realize something. As the players entered the boss arena, she spent a long time describing to the dragon specialist in the party, who hadn't asked and did not want to know, that the dragon was in heat and would literally sleep with anything that moved. In the end, she had the bard roll his wisdom saving throw for the dragon, and apparently, a 22 wasn't enough to save, so he slept with her until she died. In that case, it sounds more like a planned ending that she was trying to pass off as a player choice. Yeah, no kidding. As I said before, I can't prove either one or the other, so let me say this and we can move on. The party was level 5. Whatever the ending was planned to be, it wasn't them fighting an ancient gold dragon. Anyway, the first campaign soon begins, and more problems start emerging. She decides for her first ever game to run her own world. Alright, bit ambitious, but alright. Then she waits until all the players have made their characters, before sending everyone the lore, and hoo boy, there was a lot to unpack. First of all, only one player had picked human, and it was a player with whom she had a vendetta with, since he was the only one who called her out whenever she did something particularly uncomfortable or inappropriate in-game. So, in her world, humans were basically created as a mistake by the gods, and pretty much fucked the entire world up, because humans is bad! Like, all of them. To a face, literally. Meanwhile, the race her best friend Cleric picked, I think it was Simic Hybrid, one of those playtest races D&D Beyond puts out every once in a while, while taking a break from eating all the money in the world, were basically created by the gods to be all-powerful mortal encapsulations of divinity. They had a bunch of powers and special effects that no other race got, including the ability to come back from the dead up to 3 times, with no penalty or cost. Just to reiterate, nobody else got powers based on their race except Cleric. And to be clear, nobody had access to this backstory until the day before the first session, where they weren't allowed to change characters anymore. When the campaign began, the favoritism got worse. Cleric soon discovered that she could get away with basically anything, so she would sit there in silence, rolling a d20 over and over again. Then, as soon as it rolled high, she would announce that she is stealing from another member of the group. And Warlock would always allow it. No contested check or anything. And you couldn't get back whatever it was she stole from you. Oh no, it's hers forever now. So she always had the best magic items and the most gold, and the plot important MacGuffins, and believe me, there were a lot of those. the worst part is, whenever someone else tried to steal from her, or an NPC, suddenly they had to make the check after declaring it. Then they had to have higher passive perception than their target. Then the target got both a dex check and a wisdom saving throw to protect their shit. All of which mysteriously vanished the moment Cleric rolled high again. And it wasn't just the mechanics, world, lore, gameplay, and skills that were tilted in her favor either. One session in, I left the table for maybe 2 minutes to take a whiz. When I came back, suddenly it was super important to all of us that we help Cleric become head of the Thieves Guild, which apparently controls every thief in the entire world with no challenge to its power at all. Why should we care? Because they have a magic item that you can take if she runs it. But we all have magic items by this point, and she has most of them anyway. Well, you've already decided to do it now, so too bad. So, after months of fetch questing and doing jobs that basically always involved Cleric making one stealth check, followed by another if she rolled low, repeated until she succeeded, and followed with 3 hours of them talking about it while we sat around picking at the table fluff, she finally became the leader of all the thieves in the entire world. A job that is remarkably easy to do, and that didn't stop her from abandoning her guild for years at a time to do quests. At this point, I expressed my fears to Warlock in the hopes that she would get better, and she assured me she has quests centered around all our characters coming up. So, with a little more open-mindedness, we arrived at my Cavalier Fighter's quest, and it was... brace yourself. Drumroll, please. Go and clean out a hobgoblin fortress with something like 9 or 10 hobgoblins in it. Yes, I am being serious. So we clear the fort in like half a session, thinking this is just the opening plot hook or something. And then she asks me if I enjoyed my personal quest and moved on to the next one. Wait, what? That was it? Cleric got months of content all about taking over an assassin's guild, and I get one fortress that I don't even get to keep afterwards? Bull fucking shit. So the campaign was one uninteresting slog from one railroad to the next. All of them so shamelessly ripped off anime and League of Legends character lore that in the end, I could just message my anime watching friend after every session, and he would flawlessly predict each upcoming twist or mission without even being in the fucking game. But the worst part of this saga is yet to come. If life were a campaign, then our group would be unconscious, down to death saves, and with no friends in sight. So here's how Warlock stomped on its face until it died. So at this point, we were all visibly unengaged. Even Cleric, who was just coming around to the realization that being 10 times better than the rest of the party doesn't exactly make for a very interesting gameplay. But nobody could have predicted what Warlock would do. One day, the Discord chat blings with a new alert. It's Warlock, saying that she feels nobody is enjoying the campaign, no doi, and that in the interest of everyone, she feels it would be best to cancel the game, no doi, and the entire group in general. Wait, what? Much doi. Yes, she basically decided on my behalf to cancel the entire group, because nobody was enjoying her game. Apparently she thought being the DM made her the leader of the group, and gave her the right to make executive decisions, like capping the entire business in the head, and burying it in a shallow grave in the woods. At the time, it was such a shock that nobody could process it enough to argue, and the Discord chat was deleted so fast, most of the players didn't even have time to read the message itself. So, nobody made any attempt to salvage the pieces, and the mighty self-destructive Warlock marked the end of 2 years of gaming. So that was how it ended. I never played with Warlock again, and the group never reformed. However, there is a silver lining to this amorphous black mass that one would hardly tentatively call a cloud, so much as a sign from the gods. Today, I have a new group full of wonderful people, and plans are underway to start a second. I still play with members of the old group, and have since introduced many new players to the game. Warlock, meanwhile, tried to get another group going, couldn't find any players, and eventually lost her passion for the game entirely. If one could imagine this as a battle between me and her, which I think one conceivably could, it's pretty clear who won. My only regret is that Cleric completely lost her taste for TTRPGs and never went back to them, their potential for her crushed under a landslide of problems she was too inexperienced to realize were all Warlock's fault. And with that, I don't agree. I don't believe all of the problems were Warlock's fault. I believe the DM should have stepped up. Aside from that, oh my gosh, this has to be one of the worst players I have ever heard about, and one of the worst DMs I have ever heard about. The way she implemented a new rule to force the bard to roll to see if he would enact on his nymphomania that he didn't even have, and then calling it player agency. Oh my gosh. This player needs to go talk to a psychologist. Sigmund Freud would have a field day with her. Gosh. Honestly, the manipulation that this player did to her friend, to the DM, to the group, it's terrible. If there's anything you can take away from this, don't manipulate people, don't force your campaign to be anime episodes, and don't force sexual content into your games or your friends' backstories. Thank you guys for watching the video. If you want to support me, the best way to do so is by hitting the like button and subscribe button, and also leaving a comment. But if you want to support me more, you can do so over on Patreon, which would be greatly appreciated. That's going to do it for today. So until next time, hope you feel inspired.